Great. So a lot of talks about ML and AI and security, and this is about good old-fashioned people, right? The human beings we got to get to do things. How do we get them more time so they can do those things? So where I was going to start with this is let's think about what life is like in the enterprise, right? It's constantly a lot of interruptions, right? So we've got people. There's tickets going off. There's people interrupting to do things. And then we're in a scenario where people are either waiting on us, right? All these incoming requests, or we're now waiting on somebody else. We got to fill out a ticket. We got to wait for them, right? So life is filled with interruptions and waiting. Does this sound familiar to people who work in operations? And all that stuff is constant context switching, right? Can't get things done because of that. So then along comes this thing like SRE, right? Seems great, right? In fact, it seems too good to be true. Like, how's this possible, right? How do people find time to spend half of their time working on engineering tasks and all these great things we hear about? So what effectively happens, these stories are getting out there. More and more companies are adopting this SRE style of working, right? And reporting these great results. And Google kicked off the trend by writing some books. I actually wrote a chapter in the Seeking SRE, which was O'Reilly's first non-Google book. Actually, the chapter, we reprinted it. It's over in the Rundeck booth. So you can read about that. It's a vendor-neutral look at how the enterprises get to SRE. So effectively what ends up happening now is these enterprises are saying, hey, this sounds great, right? So we have these SysAdmins, right? So they should be SREs. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to erase their name and we're going to call them SREs, right? And everything is going to be happy and fine. But it really comes up more like this, right? It's like the pony-haired Dilbert boss comes in and is like, your new title is SRE, right? Now learn to code and be better at doing operations, right? And they're buried in cab calendars and these long, drawn-out multi-week processes and told to study all the ITIL books. I don't know how many there even are now. There's a whole new version, right? And these things like quality is job number one, right? Like people aren't trying to do things with high quality. So what ends up happening is, all those things I talked about in the beginning that were overloaded, there's constant firefighting, we're waiting in ticket queues for everything, things break and break again, everyone's busy, but things don't get a lot better. Then of course the bosses, super helpful, come in on top and they're saying, hey, everything's taking too long and costing too much and breaking too often. But now that we got SREs, what's going to happen? It's the same things, right? We're constantly overloaded, we're firefighting tickets. And so the reality is that, changing job titles or even adding these individual skills, like saying, oh, we're going to coach people up in more, coding skills, or this new observability area, right? Or, microservices architectures, or, any of the kind of trends that you see going on in the SRE conversations. We can inject those individual skills into people, but if we still are working in that same way, we're burying them under all that old crap. For lack of a better term, they don't have the time to do much with that, right? And so the reality is, you see the companies, the reality is that, what makes SRE is it's really kind of a rethinking of how operations works, right? It's a fundamentally kind of rethinking of the principles behind how, operations gets its job done. So if you go back to the SRE books and you talk to, from the Google perspective, I think they've done the best job of really cataloging these ideas. What makes it different, they have these three principles of what SRE actually is, right? So the first one is SREs need service level objectives with consequences, right? The with consequences part is the interesting one. So first, what is a service level objective, or SLO in the hip term? It looks a lot like an SLA at first glance, right? It's like, oh, we've got some measure. Here we call it the service level indicator. And there's 0 to 100%, right? And then we have to figure out with the business, what is that acceptable level of service, right? Now, where it starts to get different is they think of that as actually an error budget, right? Saying that, error, E-R-R-O-R, that there is this gap between perfection and what is actually acceptable, and we should use that amount as a budget to spend towards things like moving faster, trying new experiments. And as long as we're in that zone, we're in that, we still have air budget to use, things are fine, right? But where the shared responsibility comes in, this is kind of the fascinating part, is that in this, why it says with consequences, because this is an agreed upon, kind of a contract, if you will, between development, business, and operations. And everybody has to agree to that. And where it gets wild from the kind of classic enterprise ops point of view is unlike an SLA that's generally put on to ops, like that's just your SLA and that's your problem. If you break it, the penalty comes onto operations. In the SLO world, it's actually everybody's responsibility, right? So if we blow that air budget, if we fall below that SLO, everybody has to swarm to fix that problem. And if that means that dev's not shipping new features, so be it. The business has to accept that, right? Because it's a true shared responsibility model. Sounds easy to say, but if you actually think through your life and how that actually works, it seems asinine. Right? It's crazy to even suggest that, right? Like you can tell the development side and the business side of the house, slow your roll. Like we've got, we're blowing this air budget. You have to basically come and help us. And that might even mean developers have to carry the pager. Who knows what it means, right? And so, that is a dramatic departure from the kind of classic operations thinking. And that really is sort of considered kind of, principle one of SRE. Number two is SREs need to have time to make tomorrow better than today. And that's where, have you heard the word toil? Anybody? Maybe a few folks, right. So toil is great because it's put this name on a problem that we've kind of all felt probably for, the decades we've all been in operations. And Vivek Rao from Google did a good job of summarizing. He says, toil is the kind of work tied to running a production system that tends to be manual, right? Repetitive, stuff we do over and over again. Automatable, meaning we could have automated it. Tactical, devoid of enduring value, which I think is the key term. And scales linearly as the service grows, right? Meaning that if we have a service today and it has 1,000 users, if we get 1 billion users tomorrow, is the number of people we need to manage that service going to grow linearly with that service? And if you kind of break it down, the difference between the opposite of toil is engineering work, which is what we're trying to achieve, right? So toil, it lacks that enduring value. I mean, it's not making tomorrow better than today. It might be 100% necessary to keep the business running, right? But it still should be considered toil if we're not actually making tomorrow better, right? Toil tends to be rote and repetitive. Engineering work tends to be creative and iterative. It builds on itself, right? Toil often tactical, engineering work strategic. Toil increases with scale, right? The more scale of our systems, the more we're going to have of this. Engineering work is all about enabling scale, right? And toil can be automated. A computer could do it. And engineering work is kind of the most fundamental test, requires human creativity, right? We need the human beings to add their value to that. So why this is so important is there's a balance. There's only so much time all our people have, and the balance between the toil and engineering work, if we have enough time for engineering work, we can do two things. We can improve the business, make tomorrow better than today, and most importantly, we can fight back against that toil. We can spend some of that to actually pay down that fight against the toil, the interruptions. But if toil becomes an unmanageable or kind of crowds out the engineering work, we go into this situation where we don't have the time to improve the business, and most importantly, we don't have time to reduce the toil, right? So we're effectively in this death spiral where we're never going to climb out from under this toil. And I think if you look inside a lot of enterprises, most operations teams find themselves in that position, right? Where we just don't have time to get to the stuff that we need to improve. So part three, principle three, is that SRE teams have the ability to regulate their workload. And I don't think I have a slide on this, so I'll just explain it. It's a fascinating idea, but if you look at how everything's about that shared responsibility model between dev and ops, in a lot of the SRE kind of adherent organizations, they figured out we should separate running in production with owned by SRE or operations. Right? So literally they'll say, well, operations is able to say, no, I'm not going to take responsibility for that application. It's too buggy, it doesn't have the right procedures set up, whatever it might be. They can say no. Now, what they'll do is they'll say, well, hey, we have this operations readiness checklist. And if you meet that minimum criteria, you can run it, development team. Here's the pager, you can do it, you can use our infrastructure and our tools to run it, but it's on your responsibility to run that thing. And we'll only accept responsibility for that application once it meets this other criteria that says it's reached a level of stability and maturity that will take responsibility for it. Now that blows people's minds, right? Like, oh, well, how can you have something run in production that's not owned by operations? And the point is that stops that pushing things that aren't ready, right? Or it says go when it's ready, but you have control of it because your people are it's still not done yet, right? And that also stops the whole kind of, the marketing, because it gives a positive, or I guess a negative feedback up the chain to say, hey, if marketing says this has got to go on this date, well, that's fine, but if development agrees that it's done, then they have to be responsible for running the thing as well, right? It's a fascinating kind of realignment of responsibility, and they do that by separating something running in production with something owned by operations. And I know many people think it's a bridge too far, but it's a fascinating idea to think about how that works. It's fundamentally a rethinking of what operations is. So if you're thinking about this, it's like, well, in the enterprise, the SRE, how do we get started with that, right? Well, this first one, which is kind of what is the sort of the core principle of that you have these service level objectives with shared consequences across the organization. That's really hard, right? That's a company culture change. Likewise, this idea of regulating their workload, being able to say no to things, right? That is an equally hard company culture change. I'm not saying avoid those things, but I think people might think you're a little bit nuts if you just walk around talking about those things. It's going to take time to develop that understanding of why those principles are important. But the one in the middle, right, the toil one, right, giving people time to make tomorrow better than today, that's something where everybody wins, right? That's an area where you can have that conversation without saying the word SRE with anybody, get started, make the time for the teams to work on these improvement projects while you're in parallel working on 1 and 3, which is the longer kind of culture-changing conversation. So, I would suggest in an enterprise setting, I've seen a lot of success of people starting with the toil idea and then working kind of the slow roll on the other side. So why focus on toil? Really two things. As I said, lots of value independent of SRE, right? If you just say, hey, don't we want our teams to be more effective? Don't we want our organization to get all these things on the wish list? We're starting to get these things done, of course, right? So it's an easy thing to sell without even having to sell the idea of SRE. You can kind of save that for another day. And our people are most expensive assets, right? We have to stay out of their way. And not just when we're doing planned delivery work, right? But also when we're doing incident work, right? Responding to incidents, empower them with the right tools along the way. So tickets are kind of one of these great sources of or indicators of toil going on in an organization, because we get these interruptions and waiting and handoffs, and we kind of all see it right happening right there, right? Well, we have this idea where we have these two different parts of our organization. Nothing lives in isolation in the enterprise. Somebody always needs something from somebody. We have this idea where we're going to drop a ticket queue in the middle. We all know how this goes, right? You put something in the queue, it sits there. You got to go find a project manager. They'll bug somebody to pull it off the queue. They don't understand what you wrote because you're not a firewall expert, right? And then they give you something back and it's not right, and you got to go round and around, right? It's the common dance that we all do. And unfortunately, all of that back and forth, it's also what we call like snowflake makers, right? And a snowflake is this kind of great little phrase that means that that thing might be technically correct at that exact moment in time, but it's brittle and unreproducible, right? Just like a snowflake, right? There's only one in the universe, and that's a snowflake. And all these manual changes and all of these, a lot of these ticket requests, that's what happens, right? We open a ticket, it goes on someone's queue, it finally gets to them, they jump in totally cold to what's going on there. They do their best, they're the expert, they parachute in and do it, but often it's just a little bit different than the last one, or not quite what people are expecting, and you end up with these kind of snowflakes. These snowflakes make a lot of one-offs. These one-offs are what makes it difficult to automate away a lot of that toil, and also creates new toil because it creates all these unexpected sources. So if you're going to start to looking at, how do we start to get on tracking toil and eliminating toil? Number one, the easiest step, actually track the toil levels, right? And it's not, full-fledged time tracking is not needed. Often I've seen project managers or scrum masters, do this, where they just sort of kind of on a weekly or monthly basis do an audit of the team, even talking to people, how much of your time is spent on this kind of work versus that kind of work, to get a sense for what is the toil level for each of our teams. And then set a toil limit, right? I think the conventional wisdom these days is like 50% of people's time. You want to keep it below 50% for things, these interruptions and incidents and repetitive work. And then, fund those efforts to reduce the toil on the team, especially on the teams that are already over the limit. There's kind of two ways to do that. One is the obvious one, which is like just get rid of it, right? So figure out, well, if every time we add a partner, we have to go in and manually change a configuration setting somewhere in this app, let's get rid of that. Let's put that into the app somewhere and people can figure that out. Or if we have to do some database maintenance or cleanup every once in a while, let's just try to automate it so the app does it itself, right? There's things we can do to just change the process or change the applications. But there's a lot of stuff where we just have to kind of find and fix these different anti-patterns out there. And a lot of them, we found are really kind of dependent on enabling self-service, right? Helping people do things for themselves so we don't have to inject these tickets and inject all this waiting, inject interruptions onto people. So, some of these anti-patterns, like I call it like the do it again, and do it again, right? That's constantly, I need you to do something, they do it, need to do something, do it again. And you're constantly, someone's waiting, someone's being interrupted, and the things that they could be working on keep, just like if you're enabling self-service to do them, they can do it for themselves. We don't have to, we can get rid of a lot of that toil. Same way with access control. We have a lot of situations where, hey, if I can just get to it, I know I can do it, but I can't get to it because it's in a different environment. I'm opening a ticket, versus if you enable people with that self-service access, and if you do it in the right way, you actually make compliance happy because there's a record of that change, and you're not constantly interrupting people, and you're not waiting. A favorite one, source of kind of death by 1,000 cuts we see, is I'm the expert. I don't read the wiki, right? So in the meantime, some stuff's changed, right? It's like, oh, well, you don't use this flag, the service is going to blow up when you restart it, right? Or the knock's like, hey, every time you restart this thing, your alarms are going off, and it's 20 minutes to figure out that it's just you restarting something. So can you please quiet the monitoring before you, do that restart? Later, 3 in the morning, you roll out of bed, you're like, I've done this for 5 years. I don't need to read the wiki, right? And you use the old flag, you don't quiet the monitoring, and everything, kind of blows up. Versus using self-service as a way to collaborate on standard runbooks or standard operating procedures that we update those, right? Those automated runbooks. And then when you roll out of bed at 3 in the morning, you don't have to remember all these things that people had told you. And you don't have to embarrass the expert by telling them they have to read the wiki next time, right? There's other ones too, like the dog pile, right? Like how many times you see during an incident, like you log in and the bridge call's going and you're like, oh, I think it's a problem. Someone says, I think it's a problem with DB7 or whatever it is, right? And oh, that database server, right? And then you log in, you run top, and the first 10 entries are the 10 other people on the call running top, right? So like, again, self-service, like we can do a situation where one person can run top, right? And then everybody else can follow the output, right? Without clobbering dog pile, right? And we found that self-service is actually kind of fascinating. We've seen people turn into really strategic initiatives. Jody Mulkey, the former CTO of Ticketmaster, talked about this at the DevOps Enterprise Summit. They had a problem where their average MTTR was 47 minutes. So web incidents, average incident was 47 minutes long, which if people can't buy, Yankee playoff tickets, that's a long time, right? It's like CNN News. By putting in sort of focusing on self-service, built by development, tested by development, and then handed off to operations, they could push control closer to the edge of the problems. They actually empowered the NOC to take control. And in I think about 18 months, they got their MTTR down to 3.8 minutes, right? Because they realized so many things happen time and time again, but get rid of the escalators, right? And push it down to the people on the edge. And the part that really they liked the best was they actually figured out that they cut their escalations in half. So the dev side of the house loved it and had more incentivized to continue it because all this stuff wasn't constantly being escalated up the chain to them with more interruptions and causing waiting for everybody, including the customer. Last one here, Sean Norris, Standard Chartered Bank, huge bank outside the US, all over emerging markets, something like 60 different countries with their own regulatory schemes, 86,000 employees. And for them, it was a matter of you can't have people in Indonesia accessing the banking accounts for people in Singapore and vice versa. So they used self-service as a way to, number one, standardize how people do their work, but number two, distribute that access. So now they can distribute the labor across their organization and build compliance consistency in. And in the first 12 months of doing that, they freed up 28 person years of time just from redistributing the load and not having to have this horrible scenario where if you wanted to do something, you had to raise a special ticket that had to be approved, that got you a special password, that got you into production, where you had to do a screen recording video of what you did so your boss could watch that video. I mean, it's insane, but if you think about it, they were built for compliance. As a bank, and their customers would expect no less, and they had 60 different regulatory regimes to work with, this is important, right? And they had they had 200 less customer impacting events, which means they shot themselves in the foot 200 less times in that year because of all the non-standard effects. So online, you can read this, rundeck.com/self-service. We're trying to kind of document this pattern. We named it self-service operations, but we see a lot of organizations kind of going this direction. So we're trying to collect that information and collect ideas. It's kind of it's a vendor neutral, really kind of look at this document, this design pattern. So if you want to read about it, just read it online. You don't have to register. You just go there, and it's all in HTML. You can download a PDF. And if you have stories or you have questions or you want to contribute something to that or poke holes in it, let me know. So I know I'm over time. Recap. SRE, it's more than a job title, right? It's changing how we think about operations work. Air budgets and toil limits are incredibly useful, but let's be practical, right? I mean, don't fight the good fight, but if you focus on the toil first, everybody wins, and you can really make some headway while you expand the rest. Finding and fixing those anti-patterns is a way you can empower teams to go at it. You don't need a large, kind of monolithic project. You can just empower people to start, beating back these anti-patterns and apply that self-service operations design pattern. So.
Anybody have a question there? I've been itching to ask Damon. We got one. All right, that's perfect because that's how much time we got.
I'll post that deck and my new. I'll post that deck and my new deck.
So it's a great idea, and as a sysadmin by training, there's a ton of tasks I can think of automating this. However, I can't imagine a number of other groups like the DBAs letting us restart database servers because we're sysadmins, we don't know what they're doing, and they're DBAs, and we know they don't know what they're doing.
Yep.
So so the question is how do you get other groups to enable this, and how do you prevent people from, I clearly know that restarting the database is going to fix this issue, restarting databases that don't fix the issue?
Yeah, that's a very good, so the way we see it is it's about building as many guardrails in, right? So you have to, first of all, I think the success breeds other success. So the way we talked about sort of solving these anti-patterns kind of on a one-off basis is because you see it where it's like, oh, web restarts, right? Well, how do you do a web restart? Well, it seems so easy. It's like, oh, I run a restart script. Well, but before that, I quiet the monitoring, then I talk to F5, and I drain off the traffic, and then I got to watch to see the traffic's off. Then I run my restart. Then I check my 5 or 6 things that I know I have to check just kind of offhand to see if that service has been restarted. Good, it's working. Now I go back to F5, put traffic back on it, looks good, unquiet, turn back on the monitoring. Well, how do I hand that off to some developer now? Right, because I can't just give them an SSH key and some sudo privileges and a script and say a prayer, right? So the idea is you have to be able to build that logic into it, those guardrails into it, and that's from like an open source perspective, like Rundeck. That's the point of a framework like that. That's why we kind of got into this business. Is you need to be able to give them an easy way, operators, easy way to create those guardrails, and then once they see that, they're like, hey, that's pretty handy. So like, yeah, wouldn't you love it if this whole segment of things you don't have to do, right? And it doesn't have to be everything, but it can be a certain, and you can set things into it, say, oh, well, first thing I gotta do is I wanna run this health check. If the health check is bad, then run these other steps. If the health check's good, just be like, oh no, we're good, right? And that way you're building those defenses in. But the most important thing is just them seeing other people getting rid of the interruptions and getting rid of the toil that's burying them, and they go, oh, well, I want that too. And then they kind of will come to the table with, let's just do an analysis of the things you do over and over and over again, and let's start whacking away at those. That's a
great answer. If you build it, they will come.
That's it.
Yeah. Well, it's like if they see other people having fun, yeah, they'll like, oh, my life's, if they're digging in the salt mine and you're like, on the beach, they'll be like, I want to be on the beach. Right. I want to do that too.
One thing I've always found is the path of least resistance is always the one that people want to take.
Yeah, and if it's a top-down project, like we're going to do this everywhere at once, those are a lot harder to do because it's that, 1,000 pieces of resistance. But if you just kind of guerrilla it sort of one at a time, people start winning, and then they go, well, I want to win too, and then, it kind of helps from there.
We all want to win. Round of applause for Damon, please. Thank you.